Oh, I can't find the black ones that you gave me. Oh, shush.
I got everything. Just keep quiet because hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining the session today. We're going to be looking at starting this new unit, which is Unit 8. And this particular unit is primarily the unit which is going to help us understand how do we develop and prepare resources for learning and development. Now, a couple of things that I want to do before I start this particular unit. What I want to look at is, discussing in terms of what are the various bits that we need to look at in terms of, talking about when we discuss, the learning and development of these resources. Now, this particular unit has two learning outcomes, learning outcome 1 and 2, which basically covers understanding the principles of underpinning development and preparation of resources for learning and development. And in the context of this learning outcome, we have three assessment criteria. One which includes explaining principles of how we would look at, essentially underpinning resources and selection for resources. And then the second assessment criteria primarily is related to analyzing the factors that are important when developing resources, predominantly for the purposes of, teaching and learning. The third one, and in this context, we'll also look at understanding a bit of, legislation and obviously, anything to do with organizational policies that we have, within a particular teaching and learning institution. Now, we are also going to be looking at bits and pieces related to how contribution of technology has nowadays, helped in the development of teaching and learning resources, specifically with the advent of AI. We'll be looking at the role of what AI plays essentially from an aspect of, helping teachers to use technology to be able to automate, resources and obviously things related to, I would say, the development of teaching and learning materials specifically from a classroom perspective. Now, the other bits that we are going to be looking at in this particular unit is learning outcome 2. And in learning outcome 2, learning outcome 2, we are looking at primarily, going through how do we develop resources which meet the requirements of teaching and learning. So in this case, we are looking at finding out, how teachers, educators, trainers, essentially look at developing resources which are going to be useful for our learners. Now, whether we talk about learners from a context of, school, primary education or secondary education, FE or HE, what do we need to do as teachers to be able to develop resources which primarily are going to be useful for our learners in terms of, obviously meeting their requirements. So there are 5 assessment criteria in that, and we will be looking at that in the next session. But just very briefly here, it needs to look at how do we agree first, what kind of resources are going to be, used for the purposes of teaching and learning, how do we prepare them, keeping in mind the requirements from a point of view of national, curriculum, and meeting the requirements of awarding body, Ofqual, so the other regulators like QA for higher education, and how do you use adaptations to and from to be able to use technology. So things like the technological aids that we get to see in classrooms today typically include things like projectors, overhead projectors. We look at bits and pieces related to use of computers, touch screens, any sort of equipment, I would put it this way, which we feel, is something that can be used to, further education from a point of view of, obviously using it to enhance learning in the classroom is what we'll be looking at, when we talk about one of the assessment criteria. The other being, how do we look at guidance to assist and prepare these resources, and then the other bit would be to look at evaluating how we look at suitability of these resources, to be able to use them aptly for the purposes of teaching and learning within a classroom based setting. So I think these are the bits that we have to look at in terms of this particular unit. Obviously, there'll be an assignment at the end of it, which primarily would inform you in terms of how we'll be looking at doing the assessment. Some part of it will be related to the fact that the first learning outcome is mostly theoretical. The second one that we are going to be looking at would be able to. That means here you are looking at practically using some of the templates, or showcasing some of the templates that you end up using within your framework of teaching, and then customizing them and then bringing them across to show the practical applications meeting the assessment criteria. So let's make a quick start in terms of discussing some of these things related to, I would say, the discussion that we're going to do primarily on this unit. And what I'm going to do is obviously look at explaining a couple of things with the help of a presentation and a slide. And what we'll do is we'll develop some of this as we go along in terms of our discussion. So it's a relatively small unit, but what we are looking at in this unit is covering some of the assessment criteria which we would use. It come in quite handy, because I'll put it this way, that for those of us who are teachers and essentially people who are looking into for the purposes of I would say developing resources for teachers in particular, what we will get to see is that this is something which is going to be useful from that context and that perspective. Now, very briefly, what I also want to do is start with a bit of an overarching understanding of learning outcome one, and what does it entail as far as the understanding when we say which leads to the development of teaching and learning resources. So what I would want to do in this case is cover some part of it by looking at some of the theoretical frameworks which we can relate to and talk about from a point of view of the development of resources. And then as we go along, what we're going to do is look at various aspects of it which talk about how do we address the learner needs in terms of developing these resources. And then finally, towards the end of learning outcome one, we are also going to be looking at the accessibility of these resources by learners. So how do universities, higher education institutions, or essentially teaching and training organizations essentially make these resources available, and how do you evaluate that these resources are essentially, effective in the whole process of teaching and learning? That is what we will look at, as an overarching, let's say, for the overarching objective of understanding this particular outcome. And at some stage, what we'll do is go into some of the assessment criteria to discuss, how they are going to be addressed. And when we look at these assessment criteria, what we are essentially talking about is the assessment criteria to 1.1, 1.2, and we are looking at the assessment criteria, 1.3 for the learning outcome, one in particular. So let's start with a bit of an understanding to develop and go into something to do with how do we look at developing of these resources in particular, from a point of view of this unit, which is one of the key units when we talk about, the aspect of, teaching and learning, and especially for this diploma, which is, diploma in education and training at level 5. So this unit primarily is also a common unit. I'd like to mention it here. This is also a common unit for those of us who essentially look at doing an IQA course or an assessor course. And sometimes you do see that this particular unit is actually covered in terms of is basically the first unit that you will get to see in this particular qualification as well. And there also there is a focus on understanding how do we develop adequate resources primarily for the purposes of teaching and learning. So let's get into this and then obviously take it from there. So let me just shift you over towards the I would say the presentation slide, and then we will start. So just very briefly preparing a couple of things as we go along, just to make sure that everything is available. And I'm going to try and obviously show you some templates, which you can actually get hold of from Moodle. And these templates essentially would be, useful for you in some cases, for the purposes of, I would say, using for the assignment, and obviously, as you go along to cover some of the criteria of this unit. So what I want to essentially start off with is a couple of things. And here is what we will look at, just about sharing that with you in a second. So let me just quickly polish some of the bits off, and then we will make a quick start on this. Any questions on just the unit introduction so far? Feel free to ask me so that I can hopefully clarify that as we go along, and that should allow you to understand this, because I think most of us as teachers essentially do prepare a number of lots of different types of resources for teaching in the classroom, and it'll come to us a bit naturally in the sense that you would be able to relate to what I am about to discuss, because this is something that we use and obviously have to do on a day in, day out basis, and that is what is going to be covered in this particular unit. I think the key part of it is to look at understanding that how do we prepare resources which our learners are able to use. It is useful for the learners to be able to build knowledge and skills, and it helps us cover the curriculum which is designed, or the curriculum to which we are working, which essentially allows us to make meaningful contribution towards learners being able to learn and obviously develop and build skills from the resources that we do provide. These could be handouts, case studies, printouts. Sometimes we do activities in the classroom, which could be group discussions, and all of these essentially tend to further the aspect of how do we prepare and develop resources from an aspect within the organization. So let's go in and start. I'm also going to look at obviously showing you a bit of a quick video, which I want you to, at a later stage, look at from a point of view of a lecture that we previously recorded. And that lecture essentially would allow you to understand how this unit cross-links into the unit 4, which is unit which talks about wider professional development.
If you're a web designer, so which studio features you gotta know.
So let me just switch over quite quickly. So that's the video that I'm referring to, and I'll put a link of this down, in the presentation, so that you're able to essentially look at this at a later stage, which is a lecture on, obviously the training and development, and obviously covering, learning outcome one. This video is also going to be useful for you because it'll tell you exactly what evidence to be prepared when you start obviously looking at doing the assignment, for this unit. So I have put a link down, and let's go over to the presentation to be able to start discussion on this particular unit. So here we go. Right. So that's the unit we are looking at covering today. Let's go into the first learning outcome of it, and that would essentially help us understand what are the principles which are going to underpin, the development and preparation of resources, for learning and development. So let me just make this slide a bit more visible. And that is where we will essentially, start. So what we are looking at is that's the unit code, which is developing, obviously, and preparing resources for learning and development. So what we would want to do is obviously go into this and, at some stage start discussing. So let's look at a couple of things in terms of why do we need to look at developing resources. So if I look at why do we need to develop resources, for teaching and learning. So when I put this across, a couple of things come to your mind. One is we need to look at a need analysis. That means before we start actually the process of teaching and learning, what we're looking at is conducting a thorough need analysis, which could be basis initial assessment, some sort of diagnostic, and also looking at the needs and objective of our learners to understand what is it that they want to learn. Or sometimes I ask and give this particular example is that I want to understand very clearly why do learners come to the classroom? What are they expecting to get from a particular course that they're looking at studying, and what skills and knowledge they want to gain, and obviously, at some stage take the benefit of that particular course. So this basically helps us understand, if we have that basic understanding of what learners are looking at, what are their needs and wants, and obviously what are the reasons behind their studying this course. This would basically go into the remits of understanding and going into details of understanding the needs of the learners. The second part that we want to look at is how do we establish objectives. So when we look at establishing objectives, which could be objectives that we need to fulfill in terms of teaching and delivery of that particular unit or that particular course, then in those cases, what we will essentially be focused on is understanding and defining some objectives which the learners can agree with. And once these objectives have been agreed, we will look at, putting together resources, which could be administrative, financial, resources for teaching and learning, and physical resources which are required for teaching and learning to be able to put this, agreed objectives into motion. The third part we will look at is selecting appropriate content and method. Now, as you know, there are various instructional methods and techniques that we can use for the purposes of teaching learners in our class. It could be lectures, it could be case studies, simulations. Sometimes we use PCs and computer-based tutorials. I'm using one medium like Zoom to be able to conduct the lecture and use multimedia presentations, and obviously in some cases, handouts which are provided to learners for the purposes of self-study. So selecting appropriate content for a lecture is very important. Assuming I was teaching a nursing class, and in the nursing class, I'm teaching learners to be able to understand how to, measure blood pressure or measure temperature for a patient. Then in those cases, I need to have the instruments to be able to explain, or some visual diagrams to be able to explain, do some group activities or simulation exercises wherein learners can practically use the blood pressure monitor or the thermometer to be able to take temperature and blood pressure of the patient. And I need to then theoretically also explain to them what is systolic pressure, what is diastolic pressure, and what is a normal blood pressure range, and what is a variance in that range. So choosing resources depending on what subject area or class you teach is also very important. Then we look at the aspect of designing resources and structuring them in a way wherein it makes it easier for learners to adapt understand and use it for the purposes of learning. So sometimes you see teachers in the class give out class notes, revision notes, practice exercises, or sometimes if we look at primary school, sometimes we look at teachers using various sort of activities like jigsaw puzzles or group activities to be able to get that message across, is primarily ensuring that the resources which are being used are essentially fit for purpose, and it is suitable for the learners to be able to understand information or get that information. Similarly, we look at incorporating interactive elements wherein you do group activities, quizzes, exercises, or role plays essentially within different classrooms depending on the age group that you are teaching. And also one of the other aspects is obviously some of these resources or activities that we design have to be piloted and evaluated to see whether they are actually going to make that difference or not. So in some cases, some of these activities over the years have become quite used. So when we look at higher education, specifically in my case, for strategic management and leadership, the most important ways that we teach and deliver tend to be with the use of presentations, case studies, real world examples, real life examples, or real world examples, and a lot of discussion and role plays which tend to happen between groups of students in the class in order to bring out experience and expertise and obviously different viewpoints. And that tends to be understood, an accepted way of teaching and delivering and preparing resources. Now, in terms of these tend to be activities. Now, what are the resources? Resources could be books, articles, journals, and in some cases, when we look at evaluative feedback and assessments, it tends to be assignment or synoptic assignments. That means there's a combination of a test and an assignment to be able to pass that particular unit or that module. Then we look at accessibility and inclusivity. That means anything that you prepare in terms of resources has to be non-discriminate, has to be neutral. I don't pick out examples, or you tend to do away with examples which could be shown or seen to be discriminatory. You show understanding of cultures. And in some cases, if learners have difficulty in terms of, some sort of disability problems, or disabilities, essentially, I would put it this way, then in those cases, you make, the resources in such a way available that it promotes inclusivity, interaction, and, participation within the class and the group. So how do we prepare resources? How do we develop resources? We go through a 7 or 8 step process, and that process helps us understand how do we prepare the resources which are required for the purposes of, I would say required for the purposes of, obviously teaching and learning in a classroom or online with our learners. So that's the important bit that we, essentially look at. Now, if I go into a bit more detail on what are the overarching objectives of, learning outcome 1, then we are focused on understanding what are the theoretical frameworks which essentially underpin, some of the key parts of, the development of these resources for teaching. A simple example that I would give you is as teachers and tutors or lecturers, we all go through the process of understanding how, for example, a particular lecture is put together. So in such cases, what we tend to look at is that when we look at doing these lectures, we look at understanding what are the overarching outcomes. We want to understand what is the aim and objective of that lecture. We also at some stage look at details in terms of, looking at, let's say, objectives of what could be the skills and knowledge which the learners need to develop after covering, say, for example, a particular content, in that particular, unit or that course. And to give you a practical example, what I would do is, if I was teaching strategic management or strategic leadership as a module, I would look at the course handbook. I would at some stage look at developing the units in terms of schema work. Then I will go into developing it into lesson plans, because if I look at strategic management as a unit and strategic management and leadership as a course, what I'm going to see is that within the course, what we generally see is that there are lots of units. So in this course, there are 6 units. What I would want to do is basically look at understanding each of these units and break them down into schema work and lesson plan. After the schema one and lesson plan is prepared, then I go into the detailing of the lesson plan. And the detailing of the lesson plan that I would do essentially would be to look at how do I teach and deliver the topics which are in that particular lesson plan adequately so that learners are able to understand things like functions of HR, things like activities which the HR department does, the interrelationship of HR department with other functions in the organization. And then we look at things like what are the key activities of HR, which HR department, which they perform, things like recruitment, selection, performance appraisals, unions, looking at rewards, talent management, succession, planning, those kind of things I'll get into. And they would all be then taught and delivered in the class. But when I look at teaching and delivery of each of these topics in a classroom-based or an online-based setting, what I would be essentially focused on is choosing the right material which would be able to create traction with my learners and give them the knowledge and skills required to which they are looking to gain from that particular lecture. So in such cases, I would sometimes use case studies, I would use a presentation, I would use some handouts or journals or articles which have been recently published on that topic, and I would make them available. And in addition to that, what I will also then do is at some stage provide them with, I would say, additional resources which could be for their self-study. And these additional resources that I'm talking about would be, books relevant, primarily for that particular unit. And within the book, I would probably look at maybe providing them some specific reading material. And that specific reading material essentially would be helping them to understand what are the costs, for example, in some cases, if it's a case study, then they're looking at cost, quality, time, and, other bits of, doing analysis to get that important content out of the, out of that particular learning. So these are things that sometimes you have to look at for the purposes of, preparing before you even get into the class and you start teaching. So I think when we look at this aspect of, the aspect of preparing resources, there's a lot of preparation which goes in, and the preparation typically which is required to be done from a point of view of, let's say, even before, when you go in, this is required because of the fact that you are required to cover and have most of these, let's say, resources available before you even start, teaching in the classroom. So that is where it is that important, and that is why a lot of focus is given on the preparation before you even start teaching, as far as any particular let's say point in education is concerned, whether it's primary, secondary, sixth form, FE or HE. Now, if I go into a bit more detailing on understanding some of the pedagogical, theories which will help us in aligning our educational resources with the requirements of our learners, then we look at, Vygotsky's social constructivism model and Bloom's taxonomy. So for those of us who understand Bloom's taxonomy, which we've used, a number of times, and this is something wherein, it's that matrix wherein, what we try and do is we divide the, the learning which learners are going to do into 6 phases. We start with, remember, then trying to take them up to understanding, then application, then analysis, then evaluation, and finally you get to a stage wherein, learners are able to do creation or are able to create. So when we look at these significant models of, theoretical models, which primarily are of importance, I have provided handouts for these in Unit 3, which we looked at, and specifically when we look at, the social constructivism theory of class practice, which was proposed by Wojcicki, what we do get to see is that he talked about that, when he initially proposed this social theory in the early 19th century, he was a Russian psychologist who applied the Marxist social theory with individual psychological implications for learners. So this theory was focused on the fact that learning, is a social and a communicative process whereby knowledge is shared and understanding is developed and constructed using culturally formed social settings. So his theory focused on the fact that there is the importance of cultural settings and importance of understanding those cultural settings are very important when we look at the construct of the knowledge and learning within a classroom-based understanding. So here what he focused was that if you know the learners and you know the background the learners come from and you understand what are the reasons why they are looking at doing the qualification, it helps you to prepare resources adequately, which then makes it easier for you to address the demands or the needs of the learners. So sometimes, some of the bits that we want to look at primarily for the purposes of, developing our resources tend to be also backed up by theoretical or pedagogical studies, which is in this case related to Bloom's taxonomy and Vygotsky's social constructivism theory. So Bloom's taxonomy also focuses on that resources should be designed and catered to looking at developing those 6 levels of understanding when we talk about his framework in particular. Then the second bit that we look at is when we do talk about, addressing diverse learners' need, we need to keep in mind diversity within the classroom, make sure our teaching is inclusive, and ensure that we are able to cater to all the demands and different types of learners within our classroom. So resources should be adequately prepared, wherein they include visual aids, written text. Sometimes you look at, activities that you perform within the class, and these activities have to be designed in such a way that they meet the differing requirements of intelligence within the learners in your session or in your classroom. Accessibility to resources, we've covered that. The principles of universal design of learning, provide a framework wherein all the educational material that is prepared, it needs to be able to has to accommodate the needs of learners. And that could be for different learners having different preferences. We look at the evaluation of resources to see if they're fit for purpose. And in this case, the Kilpatrick 4 training model essentially, comes in quite handy. This was something which was developed by Kilpatrick, and it was initially used as a training evaluation model. But over the years, this model has now been used to also, kind of evaluate the effectiveness of, resources which teachers actually prepare for the purposes of the teaching and learning. So his model was quite significant initially, because he divided and proposed 4 different levels in which learning typically tends to happen, and the evaluation of learning tends to happen. So he looked at level 1 reaction, level 2 learning, level 3 behavioral, and level 4, which basically starts to produce results. So this particular model is also quite useful because it is used for evaluating the effectiveness of resources, specifically when we talk about, developing them from a point of view of meeting the requirements of our learners. So I hope this session has been useful. It brings me to the end of this particular session in which we wanted to cover, how do we understand the principles which are underpinning the development and preparation of resources. And what I will do is obviously make this presentation available on Moodle along with a few handouts, which I would suggest that you should go ahead and read, and they would help you to further, crystallize what we've discussed today in today's lecture. So, and if you have any questions at any given stage, feel free to, obviously write to me, and that you could do so on learnerwork@ukversity.co.uk. I will put some further reading, here in terms of, for the purposes of, developing a deeper understanding into, the discussion that we have done. And for all reasons, if you do feel that you need additional handouts, then I would be more than happy to, provide more details in relation to some of the, some of the bits that we have covered today. So thanks so much for attending, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.